webinar, then go live.
Thanks everybody.
Yeah, we're live.
Hello to everyone from New York and from around the world that's joined us for today's webinar. I am Kian Tajbakhsh, and as the coordinator of the Committee on Forced Migration at Columbia University, which has organized this event, I am delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists today to help us understand the plight of migrant children and their families. I would like to thank my colleague Linda Amrou for organizing and moderating today's event. Linda Amrou serves as program officer at Columbia Global Centers in New York, where she is responsible for establishing programming that fosters a dynamic atmosphere of global intellectual inquiry and impact both on campus and with the centers worldwide. Most recently, this included the launch of Columbia University's Scholarship for Displaced Students. Linda has been an indispensable core member of our team at the Global Centers that organizes the Committee on Forced Migration. Linda is also an internationally recognized attorney who practiced immigration law in New York City, largely serving Latino and Yemeni clients at the height of Trump administration's travel ban. Linda's expertise in the field of immigration and curator of forced migration-based programming at Columbia make her the perfect host for today's program. Before I turn it over to Linda to introduce the speakers more fully, I would like to say a few words about the Committee on Forced Migration. The committee is an initiative of Columbia Global Centers, led by Professor Safwan Masri, the Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development. Columbia Global Centers works within countries that host large numbers of refugees, including in cities such as Amman, Istanbul, Nairobi, and Tunis, and in Latin America. In response to the pressing challenges posed by the pandemic and forced migration, the Global Centers established the Committee on Forced Migration in 2018 to address this combined crisis. The committee brings together 50+ faculty from across Columbia's schools and affiliates who work on forced migration, as well as those who desire to create multidisciplinary, academic, and practical solutions to the crisis. This initiative is one of a number of forced migration-related activities the Global Center supports, including the Columbia University Scholarship for Displaced Students, the Amman Mellon Foundation Global Center's Fellowship Program for Emerging Displaced Scholars, the New University in Exile Consortium, and a number of regionally focused forced migration-related programming hosted by our individual global centers. The goal of the Committee on Forced Migration is to maximize Columbia's ability to provide an institution-wide program and platform to engage, support, and share information across Columbia's community of faculty, students, and staff. We also hope to act as a convener to bring together the world's thought leaders around global migration. Today is the 12th event in a year-long online series entitled Forced Migration in a Post-Pandemic World. Events in our series feature eminent Columbia and external experts and voices from the front lines, as well represented in today's panelists. So I'd like to thank you for joining us for this event, and I turn it over to Linda.
Thank you, Kian, and thank you to our global audience for tuning into our important program today on migrant children and their families. During my time as an immigration attorney, I saw firsthand the immediate and long-lasting impact of family separation policies, both new and decades old, that were amplified by the work of human rights observers' documentation efforts at the border. The migrants' hopes have always been tempered by the harsh realities of a broken system, but yet there was an implied promise that President Biden's administration would allow for a long-awaited reprieve from the constant fear. Some even hoped the new administration would welcome them. And yet, 2021 is on track to exceed 2019 in the number of people apprehended at the border, with just 100,000 people last month, 24,000 more than in February of 2019. The pressure and desperation are quickly building, with an increase in children who are crossing the border on their own and then being held in detention facilities, often longer than permitted by law, in makeshift centers struggling to help them. With the decades-long crisis reaching new levels on both sides of the border with no signs of abating, this topic is more important than ever. We at the Committee on Forced Migration and our incredible partners at the Columbia Global Center's Rio are honored to have a panel of distinguished scholars with us today to help us wade through the history as well as the nuanced and ever-changing impact of the current situation at the U.S. Mexico border. As a matter of introduction, Fannie Garcia is an award-winning Honduran American oral historian contributing work to Central American studies. Her work exists at the intersection of immigration justice and applied oral history in that it seeks to first and foremost serve the community from where it emerges. In all aspects of her work, she challenges immigrant stories of deficit and victimization by promoting the exploration of complex life histories where humor, joy, and agency also exist. She also holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in English from the UCLA and a Master of Art in Oral History from Columbia University. She currently serves as the program officer for the Storytelling Project established by the Women's Refugee Commission to document the lived experiences of families adversely impacted by immigration policies administered by the United States government. Gabrielle Oliveira is Assistant Professor of Education at the Lynch School at Boston College. She received her BA in her native Brazil, a Master's of International Relations at Columbia SIPA, and a PhD in Anthropology and Education from Teachers College. Gabrielle's work focuses on Latin American immigration to the United States, transnational families, parenting and caring across borders. She's the author of Motherhood Across Borders, Mexican Immigrants and Children in Mexico and New York City. Currently, she is a fellow with the Spencer Foundation at the National Academy of Education, where she is studying the impact of zero tolerance policies, detention, and separation on the schooling and well-being of immigrant children. And finally, Nara Milanich is a professor of Latin American history at Barnard College at Columbia University, where she teaches and researches the history of family, childhood, reproduction, gender, and law. Milanich has volunteered as a translator and legal assistant for Central American mothers and children incarcerated in the US's largest immigration detention center located in Texas. She teaches a class on the history and politics of Central American asylum that is organized around a collaboration with migrant rights organizations. She's the incoming director of the Center for Mexican and Central American Studies at Columbia University, and we're honored to have her and our other panelists here today. We'll begin with Professor Milanich. Thank you, and over to you, Nara.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks to the Global Centers and the Committee on Forced Migration, as well as my fellow panelists. I want to begin by very briefly framing this panel and how we're going to proceed. So in recent years, the U.S. Mexico border, of course, seems to recur repeatedly in the news. It takes over the headlines, crisis, surge, right? From the right wing, we hear about illegals pouring over the border. From more mainstream sources, we hear about children in cages and family separation. And then, of course, the issue disappears, only to recur again a few weeks or months or years later. And of course, this story seems to feature a striking set of protagonists, namely families as well as children, and particularly unaccompanied children, primarily from Central America, which we'll talk about momentarily. So just last month, we were confronted with news of yet another surge, right, of border facilities overwhelmed. And of course, what's different now than during the last surge is that we have a different presidential administration in the United States, the Trump administration, which of course built much of its profile around harsh border enforcement, around frankly xenophobic discourses, is no more. That administration is no more. It has been replaced, of course, by a different administration, which at least in theory has struck a different tone at the border. Although it has abolished some Trump policies, but as Linda mentions, it has quietly kept others. And yet, while we have this change of administration, the headlines themselves seem to recur. So what is happening and why? Why is this happening? So I want to give a very brief, big picture overview in my brief remarks. How many people are arriving? Who are they? Why are they coming? Is there in fact a crisis? And if so, what kind of crisis? But of course, migration isn't just about statistics or policies. It is above all about human beings. And so all of the panelists here today are involved in research as well as advocacy work with immigration issues. Gabrielle is, of course, an ethnographer. Fanny and I are working on an oral history project together. We volunteered at an ICE detention facility for mothers and children. So from the other two panelists, I think you're going to hear more about the human dimensions of this issue. But for my remarks, I want to give you a little bit of context. And because a picture is worth 1,000 words, I want to start with 2 slides, and then I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I want to start with this initial slide for you. Here we go. So this is a slide that puts, I think, the crisis in context. This is a graph showing migrant apprehensions, which means people taken into custody at the U.S. Mexico border over the long haul, not just the last few weeks, the last few months, or even the last few years, but over the last 60 or more years. So as you can see, a very interesting thing happens when you expand your historical perspective and you put the last, again, 2 or 3 or 5 or 6 years into a longer term historical perspective. We can see how these little blue lines, which represent migrant apprehensions from 2012 to 2020, are much smaller than those soaring black bars from the 1990s and early 2000s and even the 1980s. So what we can see here is that in the overall trend, while of course, you know, the little blue bars from year to year or month to month go up and down, sometimes quite dramatically, nevertheless, they are dwarfed by several orders of magnitude by earlier numbers of migrant apprehensions. So this is the graph that I want you to keep in your head as we are talking here today and as we think about this idea of a crisis. A couple of additional comments about this graph. Here we can see, well, actually you can't see, but I will add that historically Mexicans accounted for most apprehensions at the border. But in fact, apprehensions of Mexicans are a fraction of what they were even a couple of decades ago. In fact, in recent years, more Mexicans have left the United States than have sought to enter. And so this leads us to a second major question, namely, who is coming? If not Mexicans, then who? In a nutshell, we have witnessed an increasing proportion of Central Americans, specifically from the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America, namely Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. A second characteristic that I want to point out, and I'm going to show this momentarily, and then I will stop sharing my screen. A second characteristic I want to point out is not just a shift in nationality, but also a shift in the demographic profile of migrants, namely in relation to their gender and their age. Historically, meaning all those black bars that you're looking at, it was primarily young men who were coming to the US as labor migrants, which is to say seeking work, right? But in recent years, what we have seen is an increasing number of families as well as unaccompanied children. And so in this graph, again, you can see single adults, the light blue, versus unaccompanied children or family unit members in green. We don't have statistics for those, the green statistics as it were earlier than 2012 because the US government, as far as I know, did not keep those statistics. It didn't disaggregate people by family or child unit. So here's another graph, and then I'll again stop sharing my screen. Who is migrating? We can see the changing dynamics, an uptick of people traveling with families, a changing but nevertheless significant number of unaccompanied children, and finally others, meaning single adults. So let me stop sharing my screen now and talk a bit about what this all means. So in essence, we have this visual that shows us this remarkable shift, a shift from, in essence, adult Mexican men to Central American families and children, right? And these are the families, of course, that have been featured on the front pages of the papers. So the way that we talk about this issue, I think in part reflects our expectations about who normal, in quotes, migrants are. The paradigmatic migrant, I think, is a young man. And so when we see women and children on the move, that somehow is considered not normal, right? And it lends itself to this framing of crisis. So I want to make explicit our assumptions about who migrants are, right? And so that we are clearer about why the language of crisis so often creeps into discussions of this issue. Maybe it has to do with our own incorrect assumptions about who moves and who should move. So having talked about how many people are coming and who comes, I want to talk very briefly about why these migrants are coming, why Central American families and children. Very briefly, those reasons for migration are, some of them are very predictable: poverty, the impossibility of surviving and thriving amidst precarity and deprivation. Climate change, which has exacerbated in recent years, has made it even more difficult for rural peoples to eke out a living. Central America has been hit by not one, but two major hurricanes in the last year. And of course, COVID has devastated livelihoods in Central America as it has across the hemisphere. Another set of reasons involve violence and insecurity in the region. The communities in the Northern Triangle are plagued by gang-related violence. Criminal groups have taken over poor neighborhoods. They extort, they threaten, they kill. These countries have some of the highest homicide rates in the world and also some of the highest femicide rates specifically. And here we would also need to be remiss if we didn't point to gender-based violence as a major root cause of migration out of the region. Women fleeing violence at the hands of domestic partners. So these families and children present a clear set of challenges for immigration enforcement. They present logistical challenges in the first instance. Of course, the Border Patrol and the border sort of juggernaut is really not equipped to deal with children, specifically vulnerable populations, right? So in the first instance, these migrants represent a logistical challenge. They also represent, I think, a political challenge. Kids in cages is a bad optic, right? And so that lends itself also to a lot of heat around this issue. And again, it lends itself to this language of crisis. And finally, I think this population presents a legal challenge to U.S. immigration enforcement. So to put it very bluntly, if your preference as an administration is quick expulsion, then this population is more difficult to expel. What do I mean by that? Very briefly, I won't go into details, but it is harder for various reasons to legally expel Central Americans than Mexicans. It is also somewhat harder to expel children. Or another way of putting that is migrant children enjoy certain rights that adults do not. For example, they can't be detained indefinitely. And so at least in theory, practice is often another issue, but in theory, these migrants are more difficult to expel. They are also very often asking for asylum, right? So they are seeking entry into the United States through a particular legal channel, namely asylum. And asylum in turn, again, at least in theory, if not in practice, accords certain rights and protections under national and international law. So for all those reasons, they are a problem, a challenge, because this population, because they are more difficult to summarily deport than, for example, historically young Mexican adult men were. So part of the story of the last 4 years is Trump's dogged attempt to chip away at the right to asylum, at the rights that children enjoy to, for example, not be detained indefinitely. The Trump administration introduced a whole slew of changes to law and policy in an effort to curtail those rights. The other story to tell about the last 4 years is not just attacks on asylum, but the implementation of a whole series of policies designed to deter people from coming to the border in the first place. So the logic here is that if you impose ever harsher measures, like say family separation most notoriously, people will just decide to stay home. That's been the logic of policy in recent years. Of course, the pandemic is in some ways a culmination of the deterrence policies of the last 4 years. The virus really gave Trump his wall. In March 2020, he invoked an obscure clause of the federal code known as Title 42 and used that to expel essentially all migrants at the border under the guise of protecting public health. So regardless of who they were, child, adult, family, regardless of why they were coming, with a valid asylum claim, seeking real violence and persecution in their home country, didn't matter, everybody is deported. So the new Biden administration has rescinded some of the noxious policies that the Trump administration, noxious in my mind, that the Trump administration promulgated. For example, it ceased to summarily expel children, but it's kept others. So Title 42 remains on the books, and most people today are apparently being expelled at the border. So I want to pull back from the weeds. It's easy to get lost in the details of what's happening today versus last month, this year versus last year. There have been 1,000, changes to law and policy in recent years, and it's easy to get lost in the trees. So I want to pull back and just make a very couple brief remarks and then turn it over to my fellow panelists and give you a sense maybe of the forest. So U.S. policymakers and the media are obsessed with what happens at the U.S. Mexico border, who arrives, what happens to them when they arrive. And most of the public conversation on this population focus of Central American asylum seekers focuses on U.S. law, U.S. enforcement of its border policies. And this is because we like to think that U.S. border policy is the main determinant of who comes and how many people come and when they come, right? This is the sort of fundamental, unspoken, I think, premise of a lot of public discourse, that it is U.S. policy that ultimately determines who leaves and why or when. The problem with this focus is that it doesn't address why people are coming in the first place, including, I would add, the role that the United States has played historically in creating the conditions that cause people to leave. Without an understanding of these root causes, political, economic, environmental, social, the crisis, as it were, is destined to continue. I would argue that the US suffers from a monumental hubris in thinking that it can suppress migration flows through punitive policies at the border. The empirical evidence suggests that that is just not true. Not only are these deterrence policies cruel, they actually just don't work to deter people as intended. Trump engaged in deportation and deterrence. Obama engaged as well in deportation and deterrence. The new Biden administration has indicated at least an interest in the root causes of migration and addressing why people are coming. Of course, Vice President Kamala Harris was appointed as the czar to sort of oversee and understand this issue. I think it remains to be seen. It's an open question of where we're going to go with this, if this new administration will hew to this newfound interest. And I have more comments about the whole language of crisis and the framing of this crisis as a specifically humanitarian crisis, but I want to stop talking and pass the rectangle to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nara. Over to you, Gabrielle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Linda, for moderating this and giving us this, great introduction. It's really happy to be here and learn from, my fellow panelists. What an honor to be able to do this. So thank you. And the great thing about speaking right after Professor Milanich is that I don't have to talk about, this larger overview, which was incredible. And I think very important for a lot of people to know. I wish, all the media outlets would just listen to what you just had to say before writing up the news on what's happening. It's so important. So I think that, in the minutes that I have here, I'll pick up where, Professor Milanich left us on with kind of thinking about how the crisis has been framed and how this ebb and flow, right, in terms of numbers of people, and that gets kind of constructed as an urgency and kind of like an urgent matter where all hands on deck. And then what happens is that it ends up justifying or attempting to justify harsh, policies, right? So it's almost like we're in the cyclical thing where, oh, we have this numbers, which then empowers whatever administration that is in power to take action. And that's what people expect, right? People are always asking, what is the action? What are you going to do? Are you going to detain? Are you going to release? Are you going to put families together? Are you going to separate, right? It's like all these options that, as Professor Milanich talked about, it didn't start with the Trump administration, right? I think it's a very easy thing to get stuck on the last 4 years and then talk about the wreck of the last 4 years without, and especially coming from a historian here, kind of contextualizing for us how that has been on the DNA of this country, right? This idea of separating, taking, excluding, deporting, deciding who comes in and who leaves, right? This type of politics of existence. So I would add here that, why people leave. I have been studying this for a very long time, and I'm very interested in this idea of parents trying to provide the best possible future for their children, right? And sticking to the sacrifice for a better life in terms of thinking about what could be on the other side, right? What could be the opportunity on the other side? So a lot of the media sometimes portrays parents as, how dare you put your children through this danger, right? How can you? What kind of a parent, what kind of a mother, because then to talk about the gendered politics, right? What kind of mother puts their children, drags their children through the desert and have, them cross the river and do, and my argument is usually the really good mother. That's the type of parent that does that. The really good parent, right? That is actually trying to think through the risks in the best possible way, because we all, as human beings, make decisions with the best possible information that we have. And then we're always trying to weigh in the risks and rewards of what we're going to do next, right? And the fact, of this idea that nobody puts a baby on a boat where the waters are worse than the land that you are, right? I think I read this, I forget who it is, so if somebody knows who that quote came from, please drop it in the chat. But it always stuck with me, this idea that you're not going to do that, right? So there's this intergenerational piece of migration that, yes, it has to do with all the instability that the US has done in countries in Central America, or this militarized version of language of the Northern Triangle, right? That it becomes this very militarized talk about countries and nations and human beings. So what's interesting is that, you have families coming from all spaces, right, in Central America. You have actually a huge Brazilian, Venezuelan population also coming through, different socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And now, while, last year, the Brazilians at the border found a way to actually stay in the US while they awaited their judgments, right, because of the MPP, the Migrant Protection Protocol, which had the US had this cooperation with Mexico, which basically said, you hold migrants on your side, and I'm going to decide when and how they're going to come here. However, if you hit the border and you didn't come from a Spanish-speaking country, there is a loophole for you to wait, for judgment on the US side, which then think about the information that traveled back to Brazil in terms of there's a shot, right, to go through. There's a shot to get through going through Mexico. And then when people talk about the surge for this year, we have to think about 2020 in the pandemic and the suppressed demand that happened in 2020. Borders were closed for most of the country. So then when folks are saying, well, it's because Biden is easy on immigrants, right? Biden is letting everybody in. That's not true, right? That's not true, because we've seen the policies, we've seen the number of apprehensions. However, there was a repressed supply, that happened in the last year. And now there's kind of the hope of every time there's a new administration, there's that sense of hope. And that's the connection with this idea of a better life and a better future, which is connected to families, right? To trying to figure that out in terms of what happens. So the last bit here that I'll talk to you all about is, I find the care narrative very compelling for parents and caregivers who are traveling as a family, right? So I think it's an easy way to plaster, brown and black bodies on the front page of newspapers that are children and women, and to prey on them as vulnerable populations that don't have any agency or any stories to tell, but they're portrayed, in that way. And that in many ways hits this American cultural discourse of protecting women and children, right? And then I always ask, which women and which children, right, are you trying to protect? How's that weigh across the populations? So when families are on this, right, on the U.S. side, and they become reunified, all the everything that had happened, right, the ruptures and the disruptions and everything that happened during the process of experiencing the violence, poverty, and everything that happened in their own countries, right, to the journey, which sometimes is a very harrowing moment, right, where people are hungry and thirsty and no place to sleep, and now with the fear of getting COVID, to being detained and separated, right, in many ways at the border, to then reunifying. So all of these pieces, when families are in the United States, they're not thought about as steps to or phases to. They're seen as different pieces. And my call is really to look at, when families are here, what is the role and what kind of supports schools, teachers, counselors, and the government owes, right, these families for everything that has happened, throughout that journey. So I think it's really important to think through the narratives of families, listen deeply to the reasoning, right, and to what is happening. But at the same time, I always say that to whenever I'm talking, families don't have to be in a position where they have to convince anybody of the quote unquote tragedy that they have experienced, right? This is their everyday life. And as any human being, migration is as basic as drinking water, sleeping, and moving. So mobility, it's not a factor of this moment that we're living right now. We just have a lot of surveillance and a lot of other mechanisms that show us, right, what is happening in the world in a very huge way. So the last thing that I'll say is, in my work in schools in the United States with children who were separated from their parents and reunified, under the 2018 version, right, of family separation, as Professor Milanich pointed out, it's not the first time, is how eloquent and incredible their narratives are at 5 and 6 years old, right? Sometimes 3 and 4, talking about green cards, lawyers, and the border and detention and border patrol, and all the resources, right? Verbal resources, oral resources, literacy resources that they carry. And what happens when they're here is that teachers and schools get nervous about engaging with that. Feels like taboo. Feels like this politicized funds of knowledge, right, that children bring is something that they can't interact with. And my call is to, once we have children here and they're in this space in the United States, we have to think constructively with their stories and allow for space for that to be heard, because it's an entire generation that is experiencing this. And if we don't think about this collective experience as a supporting space, right, we're missing out on learning, and we're also missing out on healing. So it's something that we have to think about, that yes, the plight of migrant families and children, but we owe migrant families and children the space, the support, and the means to make it work once they're here. So I'll stop here and hand it over to Fanny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gabrielle. And Fanny, over to you.
Yes, thank you, Gabrielle. What you mentioned was so particularly important to the work that Professor Milanich and I have partnered to do for the past 2 or 3 years, but it ramped up during the pandemic, ironically. And that is an oral history project called Separated in Oral History, which has been conducted in partnership with Barnard College and the Women's Refugee Commission to document the life histories of individuals adversely impacted by immigration policies at the U.S. Mexico border. And since September 2021, we have conducted 19 interviews with parents separated from their children at the border. And we have also conducted 1 interview with a child who was 15 years old at the time of separation, but is now 18 years old. And due to the pandemic, the interviews were conducted and recorded via telephone. And because we conducted life history interviews, we began at the beginning of each person's life and gained insight into who they were as people and how the experiences that they had had throughout their lives shaped the reason why they chose migration as the only recourse for changing the trajectory of their lives. During the interviews, the narrators expressed a desire to be seen first as human beings, as fathers and mothers, hermanos y hermanas, daughters and sons, tíos y tías, doing everyday things, raising families, dancing, chasing after the chickens in their patio, enjoying their country's tropical fruits, acknowledging their elders, living mundane and ordinary lives, not unlike all of us, everyone. And yes, they wanted to be acknowledged as people who were harmed by a cruel immigration system in the US. They see themselves as people with dignity who were unnecessarily harmed and humiliated and punished for making an attempt at grasping at hope. One of the first people that I interviewed for the project was Carlos from Guatemala, who was 50 years old when I spoke with him, but in his early 50s when he immigrated for the second time to the United States. The second time he immigrated was with his 10-year-old son. He spoke to me about generations of family who had lived on the same land for generations, but that climate change and specifically drought in recent years had made it impossible to grow food and feed his family. And he said in Spanish, "Aquí en el mismo municipio nací y aquí estoy en mi comunidad. Es una comunidad, una aldea que se llama Vega de Muerto. Aquí estamos en el mismo lugar donde yo nací y aquí estoy y toda mi familia. Aquí están y no se han movido de otro lugar." So with this quote, he tells me, I've lived in this community in this aldea called Vega de Muerto with my entire family. No one has left. Everyone has stayed here. No one has had a reason to move until what he describes as a phenomena called el corredor seco, where he says, no ha llovido pues, por la gracia de Dios ha habido lluvia por los años pasado atrás, pero hace 3 años atrás aquí en Guatemala no llovió. Y sí ha llovido un poquitín, pero todo el producto que uno cosecha, la gente, lo que sembraron, no se cosecha nada. Porque no hubo lluvia, todas las siembras se murieron, no hay agua. He says, because of el corredor seco, the dry corridor that they say is at a level in my country and is affecting the communities, the aldeas and caseríos throughout this municipality. It has not rained here. Right now, thanks to God, there is rain. I talked to him around the time that that the hurricanes had brought some rain to the area. How ironic, right, that a major catastrophe brings some relief. And so he says, but all the products that one harvests and that one grows has not yielded any crop because there was no rain. All the things that we planted died. There is no water. He lives in el departamento de Quiché in the eastern part of Guatemala, which is what makes up part of the dry corridor in that area. Another person that I interviewed for the project is Leticia, the 30-year-old mom of the young son. This is the pair that we interviewed. We interviewed mom and son who were separated at the border. And she identifies as Maya. And she, at one point, used to speak Quichel until she was bullied and intimidated into choosing only Spanish as her primary language. She agreed to participate in the project porque she said in Spanish, ya no quisiera que esto volviera a repetirse más. O sea, especialmente con mi gente, con las gentes de otros países. I don't want what happened to me to be repeated again, especially to my people or with people from other countries. In Guatemala, Leticia worked as a housekeeper, but then started her own business selling freshly squeezed orange juice from the door of her house. She talks about how this allowed her some agency, right? To be able to buy oranges, squeeze them, sell them. And I asked her, was this, I did an interview, Leticia, someone else interviewed, but we asked her, was this enough to help you survive? And she said, well, actually, no, because all the money that I made was turned back into the business to buy more oranges to squeeze. So she had a bit of an enterprise here, you know, and she found different ways to make money for herself and for her son before she decided ultimately that migration was the only way to get out of her economic situation. However, the primary reason and the force that pushed her out was when she and her son started to be harassed by gangs. And she says in Spanish, como un año estuvieron molestándonos. Cuando mi hijo cumplió 14 años, las maras empiezan como a empoderarse más de los niños. So when her son turned 14 years old, the gangs started to become more confident about harassing her and telling her that she needed to turn over her son to join the gang, to become affiliated with the gang. And this really scared her. This was her only son. She's a single mother. And so she said that this is what pushed her out. Her son, on the other hand, describes a really close relationship with mom. He talks about, in Spanish, he said, el papá de padre, mi mamá lo tomó y ella se volvió como padre y madre para mí. Y ella fue lo que me daba el apoyo a mí para que no me sintiera tan solo y estuviera preguntando por él, por mi padre, sino que ella decidió tomar ese papel. So the son tells us, I didn't grow up without a father. My mom became mother and son for me. And so this has really bonded mother and son together. And during the course of the interview, I wanted to know who he was as a kid, right? He was only 15 years old when he was separated, when he and his mother decided to immigrate and then was separated at the border. And he talks about liking things that every American child loves, such as the Fast and the Furious films. And he talks about being really connected to American culture by watching Bob Esponja, which is SpongeBob, and watching cartoons like Tom and Jerry. Both mother and son, they were both interviewed separately, but they both expressed one important key factor in terms of something that Gabrielle mentioned and that Professor Milanich mentioned, which is that we really need to listen to people who have been through this to inform us about how to fix it or how to change it or how to help people that are still coming and to respond to this cyclical cycle of migration that is occurring. People who leave don't leave until they have to. No one leaves home unless they have to. And in fact, the quote that Gabrielle mentioned during her presentation was from Warsaw, from a poem about refugees. And another quote from that poem is, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. And so for these three people that we interviewed, Carlos, Leticia, and her son, the shark was climate change and inability to grow food to feed their families. For Leticia, it was violence against her only son. And so they both mentioned, you need to really listen to us because we're telling you we lived through this, and you need to hear our stories so that those stories can help people that are coming and can help alleviate any fears that people have about what it means to migrate. And also they specifically say that they want to help the U.S. government with contacting people, especially the Biden administration who wants to reunify families. They want to serve on that task force and inform the task force about how to contact families so that families are not afraid to answer the phone when the US government calls, right? Because they've already been harmed by the US government by being separated and deported. And so the family and son said, we need to work with the US government so that people are not afraid to pick up that call so that they can be unified with their families. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Thank you so much, Fanny, and thank you to everyone for this brilliant discussion. I think that it's so important that we catch all of the nuances of what's going on from the historical point of view to the personal, anecdotal. It gives a real life understanding of what's happening at the border. I wanted to take the moment to encourage all of our participants from around the world to please put your questions for our panelists in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. We'll be having Q&A for about the next 10 to 15 minutes, and we'd love to hear from you. But I'd like to start off with a question of my own for everyone. And how do you think that the pandemic has shifted or exacerbated, or maybe even, made the situation even more at the forefront at the border? This is for all three of our panelists, but the CFM has really focused this year on the impact of COVID-19 on forced migrants. And this is a particularly vulnerable group, especially the ones that are in detention facilities and close quarters. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how COVID is impacting this population.
I can start. I would say COVID has impacted the population both in exacerbating the root causes of migration, as well as in legitimating new and ever harsher policies on the part of the US government. So it's clear that COVID, I think we're just starting to do research on this, right? This is the $6 million question that people are working on. I had the opportunity to actually lead a group of students this past summer doing research on COVID conditions in the so-called Northern Triangle of Central America as advocacy organizations in the United States were working, and actually not just the United States, Mexico and Central America as well, we're trying to understand how COVID was impacting people's decisions to migrate. And it's pretty clear, I think the jury is still out, but it's pretty clear that COVID among poor communities in Central America as elsewhere in the hemisphere has only exacerbated the precarity and deprivation of people's lives, right? And so, if people were migrating before because they're poor, now they're even poorer. Likewise, we know that COVID seems to be exacerbating gender-based violence in particular ways by keeping women enclosed with their abusers. So if women were migrating because of violence before, they're going to do it even more now, right? So COVID is exacerbating those root causes of migration. It's only making it worse. And second, it has justified ever harsher U.S. government enforcement policies. I mentioned Title 42, this code, which essentially says, or not, it's a clause of a code, which essentially says that you're allowed to shut the border down for public health reasons. So this has been invoked by the this was invoked by the Trump administration to shut down the border, which is to say to summarily expel all asylum seekers. Interestingly, of course, people, tons of people go back and forth across the border every day to work, to go to school, to shop, to be tourists, right? That form of migration is allowed, but not asylum seekers, which is of course greatly ironic and also I think gives the lie to the idea that this is actually a public health measure as opposed to an immigration enforcement measure. So Title 42 is probably the best example of how COVID has been used. The virus, in essence, gave Trump his wall. And not only did it give Trump his wall, but Biden has kept that wall in place. He has not yet, to the great chagrin of many immigrant rights activists, has not challenged Title 42, which remains in place and remains a major barrier to people exercising their right to seek asylum.
I would just add to that something that occurred to me that, we know that, for example, the we have record numbers of Brazilians at the border, and a lot of the Brazilians that are coming are, their socioeconomic status, as I mentioned, is right, like low middle class, working class. So it differs slightly from, you know, some of the Central American migrants. And I think to this point of COVID, which is when then you find yourself in a country where the managing, right, of that virus is something that seems pretty bleak in terms of the future. If you don't know if you're ever going to get a vaccine, if you don't know if the country's taking that seriously or not, right? The political instability also affected other people in different ways in terms of, this may be my only way out. And I think we're going to see versions of that. We're already seeing versions of that in the vaccine tourism, right? Of people with more means kind of doing this other circulation, which is not quite migration, but it's this mobility that, you know, public health, it's not just, you know, the politics, but which country has the sturdiest public health system, and is that a survival move to go someplace else? So, you know, and a lot of the Brazilians that I interview here, where I am in Massachusetts, a lot of them voted for the current president, you know, of Brazil, but feel very disillusioned with what happened, and then decided to then flee or leave, you know, the country because of the lack of understanding what the future holds.
And Fanny, have you heard through any of your stories or interviews with your clients about how the pandemic has shifted them, or has that not been a part of their narrative just yet?
We did talk about it, but most of the people that I interviewed are in rural communities. And so many of them had not experienced like an onslaught of as compared to the people who were in cities. But they did talk about how that has made it. One narrator in particular works as a taxi driver, for example. So working for him became really hard during the pandemic. He was also, his story was also really interesting because he and his partner had to try to have children 3 times, and she had miscarried. And so the son that he brought with him to migrate to the US was their only child, who was born on her birthday. And so the conversation kind of, we talk about the pandemic in terms of what's happening now and how they're being affected now, but it quickly gravitates toward like the major tragedy in our lives is that our son is still not with us. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I actually want to go back to you, Gabrielle, because a lot of our listeners today are from South America, and this is open to everyone as well. But how does that differ from Central America or Mexico? Because they are coming through Central America to the Mexican border, but we are seeing a different flow from South America now, especially with what's going on in Colombia and Venezuela. So if you could give a little bit of color, this is open to everyone, but of course, you, Gabrielle, especially, what's different about South America and Brazil more specifically?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that in the southern right part, so if you're looking at Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, right, and as you mentioned also what's happening in Colombia right now, what we were seeing up until, you know, the pandemic was this kind of south-south migration, right? So a lot of Venezuelans fleeing towards Brazil, Haitians also, you know, post-earthquake started this route, right, towards Brazil. So there's a lot of that happening. But then, you know, in the last 3 years, that has been an increase in the number of Brazilians coming to the United States through Mexico, in part because landing tourist visas has been a lot harder, you know, from Brazilians in the United States, in Brazil. So then you see the route being through Mexico. However, to get to Mexico from Brazil, it's very different if you think about, you know, somebody leaving Tegucigalpa, right, and going towards the Mexico border, the amount of time or what these routes usually look like. From somebody to leave the south of Brazil, let's say, or even, you know, São Paulo, where I'm from, and get to the United States via Mexico, they will usually fly. So you need a ticket, right? You need to buy yourself a plane ticket to get to a first place and then, you know, do the other part. So the difference there is really this, I think it's very rooted in the socioeconomic aspect. A lot of the interviews that I've done with Brazilians at the border in January of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. Folks are saying, I'm heavily indebted. I've never had so much debt like I have right now, right? There's I had to sell my car to put my kid into a school, or if somebody gets sick, it impacts the whole family. So there's a real economic motivation. And Brazil doesn't qualify to the United States as a country with a refugee status, right? So Brazilians that go up to a judge in the United States and try to claim a need for a political refugee status, it's the cases, and Linda, maybe you know this better than I do, but what I hear is that that's usually a much harder case. None of the people I've interviewed have been able to win a case to have that status in the United States because of the history of Brazil. So I think that we also have the ebbs and flows of the Southern Hemisphere, right? Lean left, lean right, lean left, lean authoritarian, and this. So there's all of these movements. But I do think that the current president in Brazil, Bolsonaro, aligned himself very specifically with Trump, whether Trump welcomed him or not. He really betted on that. And now there has been an even deeper break in terms of the usual routes to get to the US. And then Brazilians are getting squeezed into this newer route, with more numbers. They've always done this, but it's just, I was astounded by the number of folks at the border and the need for Portuguese speakers, but very different from escaping what Fanny just described, right? About, this type of violence. Not to say that Brazilians in Brazil are not experiencing that, but these are not the folks that usually can have the money to make it to Mexico. So I think that's one of the main differences.
I would just add that this is clearly a hemispheric issue, as Gabrielle mentions. So this is not just about Central Americans, but also about other refugee crises from obviously Venezuela, but Haiti, Cuba, etc. But it's also global in scope, right? So people coming through the U.S. Mexico border are, primarily from this hemisphere, but there are also, and when Fanny and I worked in the immigration detention center in South Texas, we discovered people from, Afghanistan, Romania, Cameroon, et cetera. So this is really, this is a hemispheric issue, and it has hemispheric dynamics, but it is embedded in a larger global context. And we really see that in who is coming across the border. And in some ways, the border is itself a sort of litmus test of what's going on where in the world. So one minute it's Venezuelans, and then they sort of fall off, and then Cubans, but then Cameroonians, right? And so it really kind of mirrors what's happening in the world, and sort of degrees of political and economic desperation, as well as channels to mobility opening up or in turn closing off. And you can really sort of see that over time if you're sitting in, say, a detention facility at the border that is detaining folks coming across.
Perfect. Thank you so much. That gives a lot of color to the differences in the situations. So we have some questions from the audience. Sayarifa and Gabrielle are asking about the Biden administration's immigration policies and how that might have changed in the past year or so, or less than a year really. Have you seen differences in those you've been interviewing? Have you seen a different trend in the immigration policy? Of course, we haven't had a long runway with this administration just yet, but there have been some key changes. So they're asking if the administration is helping to secure issues, especially around the pandemic, and just the differences in immigration policy as opposed to the previous administration.
I would say the short answer to that question is it is one of both change and continuity, which is what historians always like to talk about. There's always change, but there's always continuity. As for changes that the Biden administration has implemented, some obvious ones, one that doesn't impact the border, but is, one of Trump's most notorious immigration laws was, of course, the so-called Muslim ban, which has been rescinded. As for changes at the border, he has eliminated the summary deportation of children under this pandemic Title 42. That's really important. The Biden administration has changed a whole series of other policies. For example, one where the U.S. government was going after families who came forward to claim their children, unaccompanied children in U.S. government custody. Not surprisingly, if you go after families who claim their children, many of whom are undocumented, you are going to deter them from coming forward to claim children, and thereby creating a crisis where you have more children in government custody, which is what happened under Trump. Biden has gotten rid of that policy. So those are the so-called migrant protection protocols, the Orwellian name for what is also known as the Remain in Mexico program, which made migrants stay in Mexico as their asylum claims were being heard in the US. That's also been rescinded. So those are some important changes. On the other hand, continuity. Biden, much to the chagrin of immigration rights activists, has essentially retained Title 42. So it continues to exclude, expel, deport many people, perhaps most people coming over. And another sort of major continuity that rights activists have abhorred is the continuing detention of asylum seekers. The U.S. government chooses to detain asylum seekers, and when I say detain, I actually mean jail, right? To put asylum seekers in jail, which if you essentially it criminalizes behavior that is protected under national and international law. There's no reason why we need to detain in a jail asylum seekers, but we choose to do that. And in violation of their rights, people can't access legal counsel. They spend months or even years in prison. They lose hope and they sign their deportation papers. So this is a really calculated strategy. That too remains in practice. And people are hoping that, the administration wakes up and realizes that it is, a violation of law and not to mention human rights. So there is a kind of mixed bag here. There have been a lot of panels on assessing the first 100 days of the Biden administration, which recently passed. And I think that it's a conversation about sort of this mix. That's really the theme.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think that what you said at the beginning with your remarks of zooming out and seeing the general trend is really important when we look at the future as well, and pacing ourselves and how we effectuate change. Fanny, there's actually a question for you and about your oral history project and how you're bringing dignity to these stories. So they're not only stories of tragedy, but they're stories of empowerment, they're stories of, personality. Can you speak a little bit more about your project and how this is changing, where we can find out more about your work and why you're doing what you're doing at this particular juncture?
I think that's at the core of my oral history practice, in that it's my primary motivation to deviate from media portrayals of migrants who are coming to the United States as people who are victims, who are uneducated and poor without any agency. I think that it's very dangerous to put them under those categories and not also counter with figuring out and getting to know who people are as individuals, what they enjoy in life, their philosophies about life, their culture. It's very different when we say undocumented immigrants, unaccompanied minors. It's this umbrella term for a whole host of individual personalities and people. And I think in oral history practice and the interviews that we've done a couple of things that have allowed for agency to be explicit or at the forefront in the interviews that we conduct. For example, one of the first things is because the interviews were conducted remotely via telephone, we didn't have the luxury of paper and consent forms, right? So we had to do a verbal consent. And so as part of the verbal consent that we conducted, one question was, why do you want to participate in this project? And many people were able to articulate, I want to participate because I want to tell you my story. I want to be heard. I want to make sure my children know about this. I want to tell the U.S. government that what they did to me was unnecessary. And so this has been a valuable part of establishing an interrelational rapport with the people that we've interviewed that is based on mutual respect and a validation of dignity and resilience and self-assertion. And so it's been a really rewarding process. One example that I'll give you is that one time I interviewed someone and the phone cut out and we couldn't establish contact again, but he called me 2 or 3 days later and said, I want to continue the interview. Can you do it now? And so people want to be heard. And this was very much at the center of the project that we've conducted to make sure that we weren't just listening, but that we were hearing people about who they were, their likes and dislikes. And also because we did the interviews remotely, we got to hear, and we didn't have the luxury of good quality audio where you sit in a room and there's no sounds. We got to interview people as they were sitting outside on their patio or inside their home with their children all around them. And so we could hear activity happening in the home, and we incorporated that into the interview as well. So this is something that that reporters and media don't often get to do, which is spend time with people they interview. In fact, just yesterday, on Saturday, we were in Brooklyn meeting the mother and son that I talked about in my presentation in person because they're here. They were able to be reunited. And it was so great to spend just 4 or 5 hours with them and getting to know them outside of an interview without having to press record. It was a really valuable experience. And she talked about how she was interviewed by a reporter for a major news company. And she was one of the first people that she met while here in the US when she was reunited with her son and brought back. And she spent weeks and days and weeks with her. And then after the other article was published, the reporter is no longer in that person's life. And so thankfully with this project, we're able to continue the relationship that we built as part of the interview in many ways. Even if they are remote, we kind of keep in contact every 2 weeks or so, whenever possible. And sometimes they contact us and tell me, why haven't you called me, Fanny? So it's a very, again, a process of engagement and relationship building that we've established.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's such important work. And I really appreciate that perspective. And I actually wanted to end, we have one last question. And I think it's a good positive note, but someone from our audience, Urbano, is asking how he can contribute his own grain of sand to the shifting tides within the immigration policies at the border. How can people contribute in their own way, big or small, to what's happening? I'd love to hear all of your perspectives before we close this out.
Do you want to start, or Gabrielle, or do you want me to start? Okay. Okay, I love this question, and I think that all panels about immigration issues should end with this question. I have 3 concrete things to say about it. The first is that what you all are doing and being in this panel is part of an answer, which is to say, I think that we all should seek to educate ourselves about what's happening, right, in our country or our hemisphere or our world. And I want to say also not to be overwhelmed by the extraordinary complexity of this issue. There are so many pieces to this puzzle that it can feel overwhelming. I know personally as a non-lawyer, I often feel like, oh, but the lawyers, the Lindas of the world really know what's going on. But I want to say that no one can be an expert in everything. Everyone can be an expert in something. You can peel off part of this issue. Maybe it's immigration detention, or maybe it's the status of DACA recipients, or maybe it's refugee policy. I mean, there's 100 different pieces to this story, and you could peel off just one piece and sort of try and really educate yourself about it. Second, and even more concretely, I think I'm going to put in the chat a website of immigration justice. I think they're called the Immigration Justice Corps. Can't remember the name of the organization, but this is a website that provides advocacy toolkits, action items, which is to say concrete items, things you can do. Write to your congressperson if you're in the United States, or write a letter to your local editor about these issues. So they provide advocacy toolkits. And the third thing that I think people can do, again, this is sort of more directed at people specifically located in the United States, although it doesn't necessarily have to be, is to check with local immigrant rights organizations in your area. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of local organizations doing critical work with local immigrant communities on border issues, thousands of miles away from the border. And they very often need volunteers, often volunteers with particular language skills or computer skills, or simply the time and energy to help with spreadsheets, et cetera. And so I encourage people to look in their own backyards for organizations that need your help. And of course, in the era of Zoom and the time of remote everything, you can also help organizations that aren't in your backyard, right? But that are located somewhere else, but who may still be able to benefit from your skill set. So I'm going to put this website in the chat. I think I put it somewhere. Did it answer? I think so. In the answer of the Q&A, and you can see that website for immigration justice.
Thank you, Nara. Fanny or Gabrielle?
I think it's really important to remain curious to when you hear about families who allow their kids to come to the border alone. You have to ask why. You have to ask why and keep asking why, because it's not a simple answer. And usually it's because it's the last choice. And so I encourage everyone to get curious and to ask more questions about that. I also encourage everyone to ask how we can keep the US government accountable. We talked about all these policies and laws that have inflicted so much state violence on people, that have forced them out. Climate change doesn't just happen. It has humans' hands at its core. And human hands are usually come attached to corporate machines. So we have to get curious about that as well. And we have to hold people accountable. I think what happens a lot of time with immigrant people who come to the US is that we blame them for coming when the blame should be placed somewhere else and the accountability requested of somebody else. And usually that's state inflicted violence and policies that disregard people and focus on business and corporations and politics the most. So we have to continue asking those questions of our governments.
Absolutely.
I would add, I mean, this
absolutely.
is wonderful. And I love the website. Thank you for sharing that too. I would add, to Fanny's point, I always say that when you order something from Amazon, when has it ever not arrived to your doorstep and it has been scanned, photographed, they call you, is it there, is it not, can we refund, can we, and then when the American government says, yeah, we can't find the parents of 500 children, it's not a good enough answer, right? It's like, it's just not good enough. So I agree with both panelists to say, don't settle for just the regular, whatever information that you have, dig deeper. And I think that we all, independently of where you are, right? Because I work so closely with schools and districts, I think about, teachers in your classrooms, there will be immigrant children. There will be, children that are speaking different languages. What are you doing to support? Is your vision a deficit vision, right, towards the children in front of you? If you're a counselor, what do you know about, the background? If you are, a community organizer, it affects all of our professions, regardless of what we do. So I think that looking, broadening the horizon of how that issue, unfortunately, a lot of human beings only take action when it comes close to your, bubble. Unfortunately, right? We wish we could do more empathy towards things that are farther away. So if that's the way to go, then look around and that will happen. And I think it's really important to do volunteer work, right? Even if you can donate the money for some organizations that are doing good work, like the example, both panelists here, right, that went and did translation and were able to go to the site. If you can't do that, there's so much need for translation, and you don't have to be an accredited translator to do it. You can do that from anywhere. I've been translating, the news on a particular country to help with a case, right? Or join your local, even I live in a suburb of Massachusetts that it's not very diverse, and they created, right, a small league for immigration issues, and it's small, but we write to Congress folks, we do this, and it's like, you can't make that happen by mobilizing and listening to folks. Bring people in to talk, host a Zoom meeting with an organization where you can bring a lawyer to discuss, or do you don't have to know, right, as Professor Milanich said. I love this analogy of peeling the onion, like get a piece of it, get the depth, and feel empowered to try to think through it. I love that. I think that's such a great way to move through it. So I'm so appreciative of this space. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing your time and your expertise. Nara, Gabrielle, Fanny, you're moving the needle in ways that we'll only know decades from now, but we appreciate you taking the time this morning to share your thoughts and scholarly advice with our global audience. I'd also like to thank our partners at the Columbia Global Centers in Rio, Director Thomas Trebat, Isabella, Leticia in Rio as well, for putting this together and putting the hours behind the scenes. This is the conclusion of the year-long series for the CFM, but we will be having future programs. Please join our listserv. Please look at the other events that the Columbia Global Centers are having on a variety of themes across the globe, and we look forward to staying in touch with you. There'll also be a recording of this online within the next week or so, and we look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.